All right, students, so we're about to embark in our last sort of directed painting assignment. After this, we will be doing independent projects, and this one's going to be inspired by the modern masters. Now, this one will give you a few more options. You'll have a lot more freedom in sort of what you choose to do or the kind of style of artwork you wish to pursue for this project. But that being said, I do want to kind of like go back through and talk about um, modern painting and sort of the exciting changes that happened and why they happened a little bit, and as well as just sort of like briefly summarize some of the major art movements during this time that are considered the modern painters. Before we do that, we should talk about kind of a couple of the things that really had an influence, I think, in what changed the style of painting. Now, first off, we should sort of talk about the the nature of what it was to be an artist in the time of the old masters. Because technically speaking, artists were supreme craftspeople. They were really good at being, their craft, which was making images. It wasn't the same sort of feeling that we have towards artists today, where we think a lot more about self-expression and, oh, I don't know, content of artwork and everything. It was different then. It was different, and they played sort of a different role. And that's something to think about, especially when we start talking about photography and sort of the nature of modern painting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the Academy was one of the things that really started the modern art movement. There was a rebellion against sort of traditional painting. So the Academy was sort of had a stranglehold on how paintings were made. Anyone with any talent, any promise of being a good painter, any skill with it, and with enough money, they would go to the academy to learn how to paint. Very similar to how the old master did, in a very classical sort of style. It was very Western. It was very controlled, and it was very sort of oppressive, because they had sort of like, they decided what was good in the aesthetic. They thought they were the ones that sort of like dictated what was good art and what was bad art. And this started to become a problem because there was a lot of promising artists, painters that had their own style, their own way of thinking, their own sort of things that differed from the academy. And it became an issue where they, wanted to rebel against it. And I think that had a lot to do with these new art movements that come out. I think the other thing, though, to consider, and I think maybe just as a side note, is to talk about the birth of photography. Photography was invented in 1839. There was a small time frame where it was, a little more regularly available commercially, and then like as early as 1885, like, regular cameras could be had by many people. Like it wasn't unaccessible. And this is an interesting, step forward in technology, because no longer is the painter the only person that can create these beautiful images or these um, portraits or images of stories. Now these things can be done with a camera with a lot less skill, I guess you could say, and with in a lot less time. It didn't take months to make a painting, to make a photograph like it did to make paintings oftentimes. So I think in a way the invention of the camera sort of gave painters a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of an identity crisis, and maybe a way to sort of step up their game and changing how painting and identifying how it was different than the sort of mechanical process of how photographs are made. Just something to think about. But what we should do now is let's go ahead and take a look at kind of a brief summary of some of these art movements. Now, I pay note to these because there might be one that particularly strikes you, and you could use that as inspiration for your next project, if that's what you choose to do. So first off, we should look at Impressionism. And with Impressionists, I mean the idea is that these painters would go out into a scene, they would sort of be stricken by a feeling of what was going on, and rather than painting in great detail, they would often paint more of the atmosphere of color and the sort of loose brushstrokes and light, and a lot of it was more about a different type of aesthetic rather than precise rendering. It was more about the beauty of color and the beauty of light, essentially. A lot of people have this feeling that these painters went out just totally free-handed with their brushes and didn't worry about underpainting or anything and just went to work. But the truth is that wasn't true. They did use some of the traditional techniques of planning out their paintings and pre-drawing and pre-underpainting so that when they got to their spot and they knew what they were going to paint, they can then lay on their very loose and painterly brushstrokes. But again, something that a photograph couldn't do because photographs don't make brushstrokes. So you start to see the hand of the artist. Then we have Degas, another one of my all-time favorite painters. He's really kind of, I guess, in the realm of Impressionism, but he could also probably be considered post-Impressionism too, as you might be able to see. But again, it's very similar. It has a lot to do with color, light, and the mark making, but sort of maybe the themes were a little bit different. Sort of the content was different. Now, oftentimes you would see paintings by Degas of a woman in a bath. And this is kind of an interesting historical note that it wasn't that he had this, I don't know, desire necessarily to paint naked women per se in bathing, but he actually had a wife that was sort of neurotically obsessive. Like she had a mental disorder and she actually needed to be in the bath like all the time. She always felt like cleaning. She was always washing her hands. She was always cleaning herself. In fact, it was probably kind of more of a psychological issue with the painter to have to deal with, his partner being in this sort of situation. And oftentimes, so he was painting these paintings of his wife, and they aren't exactly happy. It's more of like kind of a struggle. It's an interesting tidbit, but it's something worth noting. There was Toulouse-Lautrec, another one of my favorites. This guy, super funny little guy with a limp, really rejected high society, and oftentimes would make friends in the worst places, like drunks at the bar, and he would go to the prostitute house and basically made friends with all the prostitutes. Not as a client, but seriously, just as someone that wanted to be friends with them. And so he got to know them, and he got to kind of see the behind the scenes, and he would show sides of these people's lives that most people didn't get to see. It's kind of funny. But a lot of times he was just sort of rebelling against his rich and proper parents. Then we have true post-impressionism, Van Gogh, and his very swirly sort of art making, mark making, and sort of impasto, and how everything's sort of unified in this sort of flowy, swirly paint strokes. The part of the Vienna Secession, Art Nouveau. This is a Mucha, and he is, he takes sort of an Asian sensibility and some of his. There's a lot of the Western sort of, I don't know, aspect to his artwork, but he combines it with a very almost flat and beautiful sort of rendering of fabrics and flowers that was highly influenced by Asian art. It's kind of an interesting mix. Again, though, just an incredible painter, and his images are just amazing. Gustav Klimt, again, part of the Vienna Secession. He again also was highly influenced by Asian artists. I mean, again, he has these really beautiful portraits, but he combines them with sort of like an element of design and fabric and pattern, and in this case, gold leaf, for these very dazzling, beautiful images. And he places his models into. The Fauves, or Fauvism, and this is a Matisse. The Fauves are hilarious because in a lot of ways they were the total punks of the art world. It's like the Academy was like, this is what good art is. The Academy was like, this is how art needs to be. And the Fauves are like, screw that. I'm going to just make it however I want. I want it to be green and pink. Okay, I'm going to use garish colors. I'm going to throw it in there, and I'm just going to be heavy-handed and not give a crap about blending or anything. And just almost in a way to be just obnoxious. And in a way, like that was what their movement was about. But really cool images that came out of that. Just like, why does painting have to be beautiful? It doesn't. You know, they challenged a lot of the sort of sensibility of the time. The German expressionism, or expressionists rather, uh, paintings with a lot of angular lines and sort of sharp, expressionistic, jagged paint strokes, hard green colors and strange colors in the portraits and the faces. Just a very aesthetic style that's recognizable, different. The early years of Cubism. I just want to throw this one in there because I love the story about Braque and Pablo Picasso being sort of frenemies. You know, like they were contemporaries. They were friends, but they challenged each other to kind of outdo each other all the time, which, you know, in a sense made their paintings better. They're always at each other's neck and neck, right? Um, but the early Braques, I think, were actually my favorites. I preferred his artwork over what Pablo Picasso was doing. However, you know, Picasso was the much more successful one in the long run, and you know, had a much further art career. But again, just sort of the aesthetic of taking an image and not necessarily paying close attention to linear perspective anymore, getting rid of that sort of Western idea, and instead of, you know, sort of plugging in pieces of perspective in different angles to get this sort of different outcome, different unique take on the scene. Of course, then there's surrealism, and everybody knows Salvador Dali. However, his paintings wouldn't necessarily be the best for this project because in a lot of ways they're very much almost exactly the same as the old masters. I mean, yes, the content is much different. There's a lot more of a dreamlike quality to everything, and you know, the subject matter is different, but the way it was painted, Dali was a very slow painter. He would take months and months and months and maybe even years sometimes on paintings, building up his layers just like the old masters, adding these transparent layers, glazes, doing these elaborate underpaintings. You can see all these burnt siennas and yellow ochres here down in the earth, and then the other colors sort of glazed over the top. But the surrealists are interesting, and there is a project that's sort of based on them, and they're very interested in the idea and concept of dreams and sort of the psychological. Frida, of course, she was quite famous. She had a lot of personal strife in her life, so I think a lot of her paintings were inner reflections. Uh, you know, she went through a lot of physical agony because of a car wreck that she was in and surgeries that kind of confined her to being sort of handicapped in some ways. And she also had a really sort of terrible husband that treated her badly by being unfaithful and everything. Also a famous artist, but we'll have to mention him. So her paintings, inner reflexive, but also very similar to surrealism in a lot of ways, because a lot of her paintings were like surrealist paintings. However, she has been termed as the primitivism art movement. So I don't know why they make that classification different. There is a little bit of a difference, though, between her and the surrealists. And then Mondrian, you know, when I think of modern painting, I can't help but think of this person in particular because there's really now just this push into a totally different aesthetic with not just painting, but like furniture and the way buildings are being made, and sort of the idea that you can turn painting into a design and just get rid of the subject matter altogether, and have it just be, primary colors and patterns, and more of a feeling or an aesthetic, and that you can minimize it and change it in that direction. And there's a lot of painters that sort of went off of this. The abstract expressionists, uh, stuffy, all important dudes that would go into their studios with giant canvases and huge paintbrushes, and just angrily slash paint across the page, and call them masterpieces. It's kind of funny when you think of it like that, but there is kind of an interesting historical aspect to this time frame, and the abstract expressionists really influenced a lot of people. So one of the things that can be said, particularly about the expressionists, was that this type of painting changed the center of the art world and brought it to the U.S. soil. It changed it from basically the European countries, primarily France, and the center of the art world became New York because of these painters. They were the most up and coming and exciting, and really since then really put the art world in our hands. The other thing to kind of contemplate was the reasoning behind this sort of artwork. And in a lot of ways, and this is kind of a weird side note, but this is around the same time that the Nazis and World War II is happening, and Hitler, and those groups, those decidedly evil sort of groups of people, are really pushing towards a very classical aesthetic. They were really opposed to what was deemed as degenerate artwork that didn't hold to the standards of classical aesthetics. And so in a lot of ways, this abstract expressionism was sort of a rebellion against that. It was a rebellion against the evil forces, right? The evil forces of the Nazi Empire and against Hitler, and in a time where that was very purposeful and meaningful. It's just kind of an interesting, I don't know, it's an interesting way of looking at these, and appreciating them for a different reason. Color field painting, Mark Rothko. These are gorgeous. I love these paintings, and if you've ever seen one in person, they're giant. They're very luminous. When the light's hitting them just right, like it's supposed to be, it enters through the layers and glazes of paint, and just everything gets filled with the glow of the colors that he's laid down. And originally, the way that these were meant to be shown is he would hang them in sort of like narrow hallways where you were forced to be really close up to them. So when you were viewing these paintings and you were up close to one, you couldn't help but be just enveloped by it. You were in the atmosphere of the painting itself, bathed in its sort of like ethereal glow. Quite cool and quite interesting. Then of course there's all kinds of spin-offs of abstractionism, and several generations of abstract artists that have come after the original abstract painters. And again, just sort of reaching for something that is more of the ethereal nature, not really going more for the sublime, and less about aesthetics, less about subject matter. However, if you really want to argue, the word abstraction means taken from something. And so, in a way, abstract paintings are taken from real life. They're a feeling, a moment, a response to aesthetics, but something that you're experiencing and turning it into a piece of artwork. One of my favorites, actually, abstract painters is Gerhard Richter, and I got to see one of his shows and not necessarily for his abstract works per se, but I like the fact that he does both. I like to see and appreciate his abstract work next to his classical sort of painting. Like he'll do paintings that are very realistic. And he actually has some pieces that were sort of in between, and this is kind of a neat technique where he would paint in oils so that they stayed wet. And then after the painting was sort of combined, he would take a brush and sort of just zigzag it back and forth across the surface to create this sort of wavy effect. And you'd see this oftentimes in a lot of his earlier paintings. Very cool. Now that kind of, basically was my summary of the major players in the, art movements of the modern master period. Of course, there's many more. In fact, it almost became fashionable to come out with your own manifesto and say, well, your art was better and no one else's is good. And create your own art movement during that time. There's so many different movements that it's kind of comical in a lot of ways, but also exciting because you just see all these people changing and sort of pushing painting in different directions, which is awesome. Now what I'd like to do though is also talk about some contemporary examples. So rather than just limit you guys to modern painters, let's go ahead and look at contemporary painters, painters that are either still alive or have painted recently, and the postmodern era, and talk about what some of the things that they are doing. This is an example of Elizabeth Murray. Here's a postmodern piece, and the idea behind postmodernism is it's inclusive of a lot more things. It's very eclectic. So rather than just being about painting, oftentimes it incorporates sculpture, incorporates a lot of different types of aesthetic. And so you can see this piece here has actually got a lot of three-dimensional presence, and it's coming off the wall. It's basically, I think, carved foam core that's been molded into the shape, but then also painted. So you can kind of see it close up. And so these are very fun, interesting, sort of like art pieces, pushing those painting boundaries even further. Here's a street, what would be referred to, I guess, as a street artist or somebody that has a background in street art, Barry McGee. Unfortunately, I believe he passed away not that long ago. But he incorporated a lot of what he learned about, graffiti art, as well as his sort of stylized characters, and combined them in all different sorts of ways. A lot of times, or one of the newer things that happen in our world is installations, places where you actually walk into a space where the whole space is part of the art aesthetic, not just a picture hanging on the wall, but the incorporation of everything sort of combined together. Sculptural pieces, sorry, let's skip that one. Sculptural pieces, as well as photographs, as well as paintings, as well as design, all kinds of things to really create a sense of unity in the space. And also just kind of rebel against the gallery, the cold white walls of the gallery and the artwork that's hung 6 feet apart. Love this. Again, just almost a absolute, FU to traditional style of gallery hanging, where artwork is supposed to be hung straight on the wall, but instead it's been incorporated into this very dense and structural piece that comes out at us in a big bulge. And just for fun, some of his other pieces where he's just painting on bottles could be a fun idea for your own project. More installation pieces. Jason Jagel, I guess. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know his name. But more postmodern painting, incorporation of a lot of different aspects. Painting, as well as drawing, as well as sculpture. And using the format of installation to really, really complete the experience of looking at the artwork. These are cool. Violet Hopkins. They look to me like little insects, but also like Rorschach tests, where, the piece of paper has been folded down the middle, some globs of paint have been added, and kind of with a little manipulation with a brush to kind of get it in the right spot, it's been folded and pressed together to give you these interesting designs. A lot about technique. Um, Another very fun and I think worthwhile sort of art movement is what is referred to as the lowbrow art or pop surrealism. Sort of this goofy rejection of the idea of high art. Something that I can really appreciate because oftentimes the idea of high art and art being superior to one kind of image is better than the other. It's it's sort of funny, and so you have these artists with very stylistic ideas of, of making artwork that's kind of cartoony but also just gorgeous in a lot of ways. There's Mark Ryden, another pop surrealists. They're sort of like doll-like features mixed with cuts of meat as a dress. Painting straight onto pieces of wood. Now with acrylic, this is totally safe to do. Oil paint would soak into the wood and actually cause it to rot. But acrylic paint could be painted directly onto wood, and with this sort of transparent application of the paint, you get the grain of the wood coming through. Sort of a neat effect. This guy, his artwork is crazy. And these are huge. They're like billboard size. They're ginormous. I don't know what this is, like maybe 12 feet tall by 30 feet wide or something. And uh, it referred to as the super flat art movement, but again, really highly influenced by like sort of pop culture, but also probably acid trips and just absolute insanity as far as color and I don't know, Mickey Mouse, another beautiful one by him, incredible. Figurative artists, I think in a lot of ways, since sort of like the traditional styles of painting being taken away, sort of wanted to in a way like reintroduce the ways that they would portray the human figure and what sort of message they would be conveying. So here's a Jenny Saville. She was kind of a rock star painter, young British painter that made a really big name for herself early on. And oftentimes she'd do these very monumental sized figure paintings, often either dealing with things like, well, maybe obesity or sort of the unflattering side of the human body, surgery, a lot of different aspects, but sort of shown in a less than classical way, a different sort of way. Here's another one of her paintings, quite large. Sort of the aspects of drawing and painting combined. And then another one of my favorite artists, John Curran. And again, so interestingly, it's almost like painting now has come full circle. There's actual painters again that are, popular in the art world. So they're no longer considered like, oh, I don't know, a hobbyist or whatever, but people are making big waves and rock star painters that have purpose in the art world and doing lovely, beautiful paintings, right? But on the other hand, there's a bit of irony here, and he's always kind of poking fun just a little bit. So painting, but with irony. And here you look at the person's hands; they are, almost like Mickey Mouse hands, and their giant, goofy gloves, and the fact that it's titled "The Cuddler," it's kind of goofy, but also beautiful. I mean, look at that face; it's great. Um, Another one of his paintings that I'm really fond of is this one called Thanksgiving. And in this painting, John Curran, I believe he paints his wife. I know at least one of these models is his wife, though I think he might have just used her for all three models, just sort of in different poses, maybe altering them slightly. But it's as if they're all sisters or, family members that are going around at Thanksgiving time. But it reminds you a lot of sort of a Flemish painting in the way that they really focus on the details of the feast, and there's the food and almost like a still life down below. And if you look really closely, I mean, not only the beautiful reflections in the glass and the sort of, you know, the details of the flowers, you have the detail of this raw turkey and how it's sitting in its pool of its own sort of red meat juice, which is absolutely disgusting. And then you go back to the painting and you realize she's putting a spoonful of something in the other woman's mouth, and how actually kind of goofy and ridiculous this all actually is. It's quite funny. But what a painter. There's Chuck Close. Chuck Close is a very interesting character because he uses very similar to what we did with the grid. The same sort of technique, the idea of gridding an image, but then breaking down each part of that image into a small, almost abstract representation of what that square was. And then seen from far away, it sort of optically blends together. And this could be a great inspiration for a project, because now that you know how to do the gridding that we did in the old masters, you could basically take a photograph, cut it down into a grid, and then alter it in this way. Chuck Close actually was in a really bad accident, I believe. I think it was an accident that put him in a wheelchair, but for whatever reason, he became slightly disabled, and he started doing those grid paintings later in life. But early on in his career, he did these paintings that were huge. So this is an acrylic painting, and it looks like a photograph. It's absolutely photorealistic. I mean, you can see the stubble on the person's face. You can see like the pores in his skin, the glistening off of his glasses. I mean, everything is so crazy realistic. And they were like 12 feet tall. He combined all kinds of sort of, I don't know, interesting techniques to get the effects that he wanted, from airbrushing to, using little Q-tips or um, toothpicks to make all the detail that he was trying to achieve. Very, very cool. Here's a close-up so you can really get a sense of those shadows on the face and the whiskers and his mustache, and the pores in the skin. Just incredible. These must have been something to see. So what I'm going to cover now is just a few different techniques that could be really good jumping offs for this project. I'm going to suggest two things. Either pick an art movement that you're fond of and either do a transcription of one of the artists that you're fond of, like, you can do a Van Gogh or a Picasso if you want to just, do something in their vein of painting. There's plenty to learn from doing transcriptions. I hopefully you've learned a lot from doing your old master transcription, so this would be a similar sort of opportunity. But the other opportunity would be to investigate one of these techniques and maybe apply it to your own subject matter. So one of the things that happened during the modern master era, the Neo-Impressionism, was the idea of doing optical blending, very much like pointillism, but with, colors of pigment. And the idea that you can make tones or mix colors by just adding a bunch of little dots. So this is a modern mastering technique that you could apply to your own work. Here's a close-up so you can get an idea of how those brush marks go onto the page. Just a lot of mixing, but again, as a sort of like a pointillism type technique. And you could pick your own subject matter for this, set up a scene, or paint from a photograph, whatever you think is best, and use this style to do your own piece. Of course, you could do collage. I mean, that would be fair game, especially acrylic painters, because acrylic is basically glue, and you can use your glazing medium to to basically, capture paper and paste it into your paintings. And you can do all kinds of sort of collage techniques with with acrylic, or maybe something where you even take it further and start adding, this assemblage where you add an element of sculpture into your painting. Another assemblage. Um, this is a really kind of fun technique, and if you want to look for something different, this is something that the surrealists made a habit of doing, and it is called decalicomania. And it's very similar to the sort of like the Rorschach test, where you start with something that you don't really control, but you turn it into something else. You let it evolve. So in this instance, essentially what they would do is they would take some sort of paint, like let's say burnt sienna, and maybe some yellow ochre or something. It doesn't really matter what. And they would sort of spread these bits of paint over a piece of wax paper, let's say. And then they kind of squish it up, and then they sort of drag it over their canvas, and then they would pull the paper away and stare at it. They'd stare at this mess just like you would stare at your wall when you were a kid and look at the sort of like, I don't know, patterns in the plaster and try to like pick out pictures, pick out forms. And as they picked out forms, they'd create a painting based off of what they saw. So in this case, the gloopy, drippy paint looked like, somebody in a heavy coat and some kind of strange, oh, I don't know, horse, donkey type thing. And they went ahead and turned it into a painting. It's just a fun way of going about it, a different approach. Here's another decalicomania. Or, if you like Pollock and you like the idea of drip painting, this could be a fun project. Pollock used house paints because they were cheaper, but you could feasibly use some of your acrylics or even your oil paint and mix it with a lot of medium and do this on a smaller scale. And these things are quite impressive. I mean, laying your canvas out on the floor, putting some, obviously you should put a drop cloth down or something of that nature, and just having fun with sort of like laying the paint down in a different manner, throwing it down, letting gravity play a big part in how the paint lands. Here's an example of one of Pollock's work. And just to give you an idea of its scale, and for fun, here's a close-up. And you can see some of the paint there is sort of, I don't know, peeling and sagging. Again, it wasn't really high quality paint, but at the same time, it didn't really matter because the overall effect is quite impressive. Oh, even a closer close-up. Or just any kind of abstract painting is fine by me. I mean, as long as you don't have to do a straight transcription of another abstract painter's work because that would kind of defeat the purpose of abstract painting, but create your own. If it's something that you gravitate towards, then by all means. And some more abstract painting. Mm. And just for fun, just to kind of show you sort of the gridding process. Your grid doesn't necessarily have to be perpendicular and horizontal to your canvas. It can be at an angle like this, but the idea is still the same. You create a grid, and here you can see the mapping out in this drawing. This is not a Chuck Close, if you don't see that in the slide, but how you could basically replicate a Chuck Close painting using sort of his method. For your assignment, I would like you to, like I said, Pick one of these art movements, pick a style or a painter that you're into. You can do a transcription of one of their works, or if you think you're confident enough, do a piece in your own subject matter in the style of that art movement. So, for example, like an impressionist painting of one of your own still lifes or a landscape. Or do something that's based off one of the techniques that I just showed you. So, decalcomania, you can do a collage, you can do sort of a Chuck Close, or you can do optical color mixing, like a pointillism type technique using color. Those are all options that are totally open to you. If you have any questions, like if you want to contact me first to get an idea of whether I think your idea is good or not, I'm more than happy to get back to you. But for the most part, I want you to have some artistic freedom here. Just don't pick anything that's going to take you too long, because we're only going to have about 2 weeks for this assignment unless you decide to use some of your Thanksgiving break on it.